Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We're rolling out the big guns today because a lot is going on. So I'm joined on the podcast by my colleague, Bill Kristol. Bill, thanks for coming on.
I like the idea that we're the big guns, Charlie. Maybe
We're
I think a lot of our colleagues think we're just kind of the older guns,
Yeah, I know they do.
worn down guns, tired guns, or whatever we are. But what was it? We at the Weekly Standard, we had that disastrous, in retrospect, the young Fred. I guess that was Fred Barnes' piece from like 07, 08, maybe even.
Yeah, throw him
Young
under the bus.
guns, and of course it was correct in the sense that
How did that work out?
yeah, I mean, you saw Paul Ryan. I think it was Ryan, Cantor, and McCarthy. So analytically, you could say he was. None of the three was in leadership at the time, obviously, and then he saw them all. He was correct to say these are rising leaders. But yeah, how did it work out for the country? Maybe not so great.
Young damn squibs. I guess. So anyway, since that didn't work out, we're going to roll out the old guns.
Good.
So hey, I wanted to ask you about your tweet. This is intriguing. That with all the testimony that we're having in front of the January 6th committee, and I want to preview what we're going to see later today, which I think is going to be a rather remarkable hearing about the attempted corruption of the Department of Justice. But the fact that have so many Republican officials have come out to testify in front of this committee, as well as just average public servants, nonpartisan public servants, and I see that you tweeted out this morning. Great to see so many Republican members of Congress and conservative elites expressing support for Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss, really cluttering up my timeline.
Do you think sarcasm works on Twitter? I'm a little worried about that.
There needs to be a sarcasm button there. So
yeah, I know, but that was David Frum had tweeted something. People who were correctly appalled at the threats against Kavanaugh and so forth should be appalled and should express that they're appalled by threats, by the way these two women were treated, and by others as well. The Speaker of the Arizona Senate, I guess it is, or House. I can't remember. House, yeah. So I guess Senates don't have speakers. And of course, it's been total silence. So far as I can tell, maybe I'm sure I'm missing two people.
So your timeline is not being crowded by Republicans.
No, my timeline is not finding a lot of Republican members of Congress. You'd think this was, since she testified before a House committee, they both testified before a House committee. You'd think there might be people in the House who would just want to say, as a Republican, elected Republican, this is terrible what people have done, and anyone who's doing it in the name of helping the Republican Party or helping conservatism should cease and desist. But I somehow haven't said, not even from hard to believe, and I don't National Review, Wall Street Journal. I don't really read them much anymore, but have they had full-throated denunciations of this? Really, when you read it, when they talk about it, and you read about what happened to them, it's just appalling. These are volunteer, I think, not even paid, or maybe they get paid $25 for the day or something. Election officials doing it as a civic duty. Tom Nichols had a piece, you linked to it in the newsletter this morning, really a good piece, kind of uncharacteristic, I would say, for Tom Nichols, who plays the kind of surly, gruff, hard-headed guy in his writing and on Twitter, and is that way to some degree, I guess. But, really saying how wonderful it is here in America that all these citizens volunteer and help us cast ballots and respect our privacy and do it honestly and as I say, on a kind of volunteer basis. I voted in person early Saturday here in Virginia. And I do like voting in person, even if it's early because of, scheduling things, rather than mailing in the ballot. In that way, you get to see other people just doing this. Anyway, Tom wrote how moved he always is by this and how it's a wonderful kind of characteristic of American democracy. But I haven't heard that from a lot of the of the Republicans and conservatives around,
Well, and his other point is this is what Trump and in the MAGA world is taking away from us. It's undermining it. It's making these people this backbone of our democracy feel unsafe. And you sent me a note yesterday, which I put in the newsletter, that for decades, conservatives, including the two of us, have talked about this importance of responsible citizenship, political engagement at the local level, voluntarism, civil society, civil courage. And here you have these examples, Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss, of that. But we're not hearing anything. Like you asked me, what about all those intellectual conservatives who've kind of taken a pass on the Trump fight, but continue to be very, very concerned about all these questions of civil society? And yet all we're getting is crickets.
Yeah, when you gently say to them, you could speak out a little more on the Trump thing. Well, I'm really trying to advance these other issue agendas and very important. And I respect that, to some degree at least. And I think those are totally legitimate things to talk about and advance. Civil society, little platoons, voluntarism. But again, here you have an actual concrete example of it, actually they're pretty quick to denounce the left, as they should. When the left pursues policies or has an attitude almost that denigrates or would weaken these kind of local voluntarist little platoon efforts. And then somehow when the right doesn't just sort of denigrate it or undercut it as a part of the public policy, but actually just tries to destroy these people's lives and goes after them in the most vulgar and really terrible way and violence threatening way. Not a heck of a lot of this is really what destroys. This is what destroys civil society. I mean, if
Yes,
the bad
exactly.
policies are bad, we shouldn't undermine. I'm for local voluntary institutions against certain aspects of big government for that reason. But this really does destroy civil society.
Well, and quite literally. So going back to this, Tim Miller also wrote something. We need more Shea Mosses, and make the same point. You and he, great minds thinking alike. That Shea is exactly the type of citizen that the quote unquote national conservatives claim they're fighting for. She's not part of the woke elite. She doesn't dislike America. Before she was unfairly canceled from her job, she was a public servant who believed in the promise of America and worked a normal job in service to this country with dignity. And she did so in part because her grandmother had instilled in her American values and a belief that voting matters. If she were white and blonde, and if this was some liberal professor unfairly targeting her, you could imagine that Shea would be a hero of the Tucker Carlson show, given a platform by the Daily Wire. But as we all know, Shea Moss was not valorized for her work ethic or service to our country in these quarters. Instead, it was conservative media that vilified her based on a lie perpetrated by the most powerful man in America who targeted her and demonized her. He called her a hustler, evoking the vile racist stereotypes he so often traffics in. She was singled out for smears by the president's drunk lawyer, a man who used to claim the mantle of America's mayor, not Shea Moss's America. So I'm going to get your reaction to all of this because you were sounding the alarm a long time ago. You were sounding the alarm on a really regular basis between November and January 6th. And you have written and talked about this and thought about this for the last year and a half. So, what is your reaction as you're sitting watching this hearing, which recounts a lot of things you already knew? What is your reaction? How are you responding to these hearings?
I mean, in sort of different ways to different aspects of it. I'll come back to the hearings in general in a minute, but Tim was very powerful on that. He just touched on race in a powerful way, but not didn't dwell on it. I got to say, you and I have discussed this a bit in the past, and Mona, some of us who've been around the conservative movement for a long time. We really did think the racism was kind of on the fringe, and it was, I think, kept there in some respects. I think we nominated honorable people for president and for most of the major positions, and they kept it at arm's length and occasionally really denounced it, actually, to their credit. But you see this kind of thing and the treatment of these two women, and you just think, as Tim said, if they were, you know,
White and blonde, yeah.
white women, from middle America who were being threatened somehow or canceled from something by the left elite, what kind of reaction there would have been. And it does make you wonder how much all along there was a kind of racial subtext to a fair number of conservative efforts. I think you've made this point before, a very important point, a subtext or a recessive gene, the way you put it originally years ago, an excellent formulation. Is very different from a non-recessive gene. And look, people tried to keep it recessive, and we all did. And I tried to, and I think with some success. And you can't extirpate prejudice from the human heart. So it makes a heck of a lot of difference if it's sort of kept under control and not, indulged in publicly, or if it just becomes almost the banner of a movement. But it is for Trump. I mean, I guess that's what I'm coming to. So many people we know still want to, the Republicans are good and they're okay, and Trump's kind of unfortunate, but ultimately it's a little bit of kind of craziness and stuff. I mean, it wasn't just him though, right? And it wasn't just a few people following him who indulged this, and it isn't just him who's not condemning this or not expressing sympathy for these two and for many others like them. And so I do worry, wonder, and sort of lament, I guess I would say, the degree to which racial prejudice is really a pretty big part of today's what's called conservatism.
Okay, since you make this point, I was talking with a very, very conservative friend who reacted to part of this testimony as well. That Rudy Giuliani describing these two women, he was saying that they were passing something back and forth like it was heroin or crack or something like that. And she said, I'm not usually the one who plays the race card, sees racism everywhere, but that was kind of shocking because that was just so blatantly racist by Rudy Giuliani. And you look back, at him. I mean, you want to talk about a guy that continues to revise his reputation and his legacy. He sees two black women passing something back and forth, and he immediately assumes that what they're passing heroin or crack cocaine. I mean, this is not subtle stuff. This is
He
not
doesn't
this is
just
not
assume it, he
dog whistle
says
stuff.
it, right?
He
I
says
mean,
it. Yes, right.
whatever his private thoughts, he's, of a certain age and whatever, you can say people can't change entirely their prejudices over when they get, but to say once you wouldn't have, maybe once he wouldn't have said it, I don't know, maybe he would have, honestly, or maybe we would have not paid as much attention. But, on the hearings as a whole, I gave a talk earlier this week to a pretty conservative, centrist conservative, establishment conservative, I guess you say, audience, business types, a lot of from the Midwest, who I do think the hearings are having some effect on Trump's standing within the Republican Party. Not maybe with the base. I wouldn't expect to see massive changes in polls, though there have been some indications there too. But among kind of, let's call them Republican elites, I don't mean the super elites, but influential local businessmen and women who have some, clout in the community and who support, whose donations candidates will want in 2024, local elected officials, lawyers, the kind of, let's call them country club Republicans, but
Yeah.
a broad swath of country clubs, not just the fanciest ones, New York or something. And I think they would still acquiesce in Trump, unfortunately. They would still vote for him in a general election, but little strengthening, I think, of the can't we get beyond Trump. They're not going to repudiate him. They're not going to say what we would want them to say or do what we would want them to do in terms of really the kind of cleansing, you might say, of the party. But I don't know if that's the right word, but a kind of, coming to grips with what happened. Still a lot of refusal to focus on really what happened on January 6th. But they've sort of, the hearings have made them a little more, I think, open to getting beyond Trump. And that's a good
It's a
thing. I
movement.
mean,
Yeah.
I believe me, I'm not looking forward to the DeSantis administration or anything, but it would be good if Trump gets weakened. I would say, though, they still don't want to at all think about the fact that 147 or whatever it was, Republican members of Congress voted based on nothing to overturn the electors and so forth. There's still a lot of denial about that side of things and the impeachment and the conviction votes and so forth and the ostracism of Liz Cheney and all. But at least on Trump personally, I think there's some weakening of the attachment, at least among that swath kind of the Republican Party.
So I was surprised by the emotional impact of Tuesday's testimony. I really didn't think that that was going to be one of the major events, but I think the humanization of what happened and the human cost of the bullying and the pressure and all the threats. I think that did have an impact, at least, and I'm certainly getting the sense that it had an emotional impact. I'm now, my expectations for this afternoon's hearing, which many of you will have listened to or seen before you listen to this podcast, I actually have high expectations as they connect the dots on this attempt to, suborn the Department of Justice into the insurrection. And I mean, it sounds like they have some very, very powerful witnesses who are going to be testifying. A former acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen, his deputy Richard Donahue, another DOJ official Stephen Engel. These were the people who were right there and in the room and threatened to resign if the former president went ahead with his attempt to corrupt the DOJ. And they're going to detail how Trump pushed the officials to falsely declare that there was widespread fraud in the election. They're going to trace his efforts to send false, fake, fraudulent letters to state officials. So I actually think today's hearing, it might not be as sexy, but I think it's going to be one of the most important of the hearings. They've all been important, but this one really strikes me as we're going to see inside the Department of Justice how close we all came to really kind of a constitutional Armageddon. What do you think?
I mean, I agree with that. And I mean, one reason you joked earlier that, I was alarmed between November 3rd and January 6th. It was honestly, I sort of downplayed. I don't think I fully appreciated the whipping up of the right-wing extremism, the Proud Boys and all that at January. I didn't expect the Capitol to be stormed. I kind of underestimated how much of that was going on beneath my radar at least, out in the country. But the one thing, having been in the White House and the executive branch, I do think I appreciated maybe a little earlier than some people was the attempt to suborn the Justice Department, the attempt to put really dubious people in charge of the Defense Department, and what that implied about what might be going on there. And so when Bill Barr resigned and announced his resignation, which I think was mid-December, and then left a week later, December 23rd, I think it was, I mean, I just thought, Are you kidding me? He defended everything else. He didn't. He behaved very, in my opinion, very well in some respects, spinning the Mueller report and all this in many respects. But even he couldn't put up with this. Now, then he had that ludicrous letter praising Trump and
Yeah, I
didn't say
know.
a word, in the middle of the whole thing
Mm.
publicly. But I remember thinking there's something bad is going on there. Bill Barr, having defended everything he had defended, couldn't put up with this. They're really trying bad stuff. And I think we will. So we will see, I think, that in much more detail today. Whether voters how much react to that, it's kind of you have to sort of understand a little bit how the executive branch works, why it's so important not to let DOJ become the personal attorney for a president who's trying to overturn an election. That's really important to see. But on the other hand, I do think again this might really affect a certain kind of
Hmm.
there are a lot of lawyers in this country. A lot of them vote Republican, right? There are a lot of people who work with lawyers all the time and their corporations and so forth. There's a certain swath of a kind of upper middle class, Republican, I'm caricaturing here a little bit, who sees that and thinks, gee, you can't do that. I couldn't be told by my corporate counsel as a vice president in charge of a part of a corporation that you can't do this, you can't use this marketing thing, you can't whatever it is, right? And then just go ahead and say, okay, well, thank you for that opinion. I'm now going to go find someone else to give me a better opinion. The other person doesn't give you a positive opinion either. The White House counsel says, no, actually, Justice Department's right. And then you go to the phone book and find some ambulance chaser and say, okay, I'm just going to use the corporate resources to do something I've been told is illegal. It's a stupid analogy in a way, but I mean, I kind of think that would resonate with a certain type of Republican, and again, might erode Trump's support a little bit among those elites.
It
One other
might.
point, I'm curious what you think about this. If I
Yeah.
can just,
Yeah.
because you've been very familiar
Mm.
with, how radio and television affects sort of public opinion immediately, and then over the little longer term. I mean, I was in a conversation the other day and says, well, only 10 million people are watching these daytime hearings. It seems to be in the era of the internet and social media and Facebook and so forth. A lot of people must be seeing clips of this, though,
Yes.
and
Right.
hearing about it. The notion that, well, Watergate, there are 40 million people watching, and now they're, whatever the number was, and now they're 10, but that sort of misses the point. So I think a lot of people are seeing snippets, hearing about it, getting stuff in their Facebook feeds or on Twitter or elsewhere, and maybe it's having a little more of a trickle down effect, as it were, than the kind of raw number. Very few people are watching 90 minutes or 2 hours. I couldn't. I was on a plane Tuesday, so I didn't
Yep.
see this hearing that we're talking about. But I've now seen enough of it, that I feel like I really did see it, and I certainly had an effect. And so I've got to think that what if these hearings are people are sort of missing a little bit of that
Oh,
impact? Do you think?
well, I think that's true. I mean, first of all, 10, 20 million is a big number, especially when we think about the numbers of who watch cable television. But you're right. When you're describing it, I'm thinking of the way we should analyze, for example, a presidential debate or something,
Right.
where you have the initial reaction of, people who watch the debate, but then you have to wait 2 or 3 days for the spin to play out and the whether or not there are those riveting moments, those dazzling details that come out. And I think that this is the same way. Most people do not watch it necessarily, in live, in real time, but they will be exposed at some point to the moments, and these hearings have had moments. So you're absolutely right. You may have by 10 times as many people are going to be
Right.
seeing clips of some of the testimony or some of the video. It's hard to know. And again, I think it's important to keep coming back to this point that you don't need to move tens of millions of votes. You just need to, change the minds of, 3% or 4%, and which is a great segue because I want to talk about this Ron Johnson story and a
Hmm.
little bit about politics. And I know you have
You're a man,
you,
Ron Johnson. I like to always call him that.
thank you so much
Yeah.
for that. Oh, so I got an email yesterday from a reporter who said, "Could I call and chat about Ron Johnson?" I wrote back, said, "I would rather have root canal surgery than have to talk about Ron Johnson once again." But sure, I will. But also with some of the polls that we're seeing, and I know that you have some thoughts about all of this. How there is this gap between the horrific numbers that Joe Biden is getting and the fact that many of the Democratic candidates for governor and Senate seem to be outperforming that, and whether that actually means anything. So, okay, before we do this, I just need to eat the frog and just do this. The Rusty Bowers story. I mean, I'm
Right.
sorry, Rusty Bowers, who was really kind of an unexpected star of the hearing the other day. I mean, we loved this guy. We seriously loved him. We admired him. We praised this guy, the honor, the decency, the courage. And I'm still really grateful for the stand that he took in Arizona. But yesterday, AP reporter asked him, well, what would you support Donald Trump if he's the nominee again? And Bowers says, yeah, if he's up against Biden, I'd vote for him again. I mean, Bill, face palm, head on the desk. We've seen this over and over and over again. And the only word that came to mind was it's unfathomable to me how you can experience what Donald Trump has done. You're learning all of this and say, like even Bill Barr, who says that he's delusional and detached from reality, says, yeah, I'd vote to put him back in the Oval. What is this? Help me on this one. What the?
I mean, I guess what it is a human instance, a real instance of this thing we talk a lot about, and social scientists have written articles and books about polarization, right? I mean, this is literally what polarization means, that someone who sort of understands or has experienced, as you say, really terrible behavior from his own party, from the potential leader, once and perhaps future leader of his own party, who knows how serious it is, incidentally. Still, the polarization is so deep that he can't abandon the party or even that person. I mean, one thing not to abandon the party, but to say you'd vote for Trump again after. And I had a conversation with someone who's sort of in that camp the other day. I don't talk to that many people in that world anymore, but this is an old friend. And again, it's sort of incoherent from my point of view. The reasons, isn't democracy more important than gas prices? Well, yes, but he can't really threaten democracy. People learned a lesson, a little bit of the Susan Collins,
Oh, man.
and look how many Republicans admire Bowers and admire others. And I think they'll stand up, and maybe they behave to stand up a little more than they did in 2017, 18, and or 19 and 20 in Congress and so forth. So people have a lot of rationalizations, but I think at the end of the day, this is why people, some of the political scientists who were alarmed about polarization, I originally thought, well, they're overdoing it. I mean, okay, the country's a little polarized. It happens, and we're not going to have a civil war. It's at 1860, hopefully. And so, but this is where you see how damaging it is.
Okay, so let's talk about Ron Johnson, who really has a problem here. Look, I've known Ron Johnson for a long time, and he looked rattled yesterday when he was pretending he was talking on the phone when he wasn't, which I think a lot of senators and congressmen do. But he doesn't really have a good explanation for why one of his top aides offered to deliver fake, fraudulent electoral slates to the vice president. And again, he's saying, well, this was staff-to-staff communication. Well, no, they're talking about a sitting United States senator handing the sitting vice president of the United States this fake set of electors on January 6th. And as I said, perhaps unkindly, the bottom line is that Johnson is not that stupid. He had to know what the context of the moment was, what was happening on January 6th, what was going on back home. So your thoughts about all this? I mean, I think that everything is very polarized here in Wisconsin. We're on a knife's edge, and people will vote for their own tribe. But it just does strike me that this seems very, very tangible, that you have somebody involved in electoral fraud aimed at overthrowing the election, and that if he would have succeeded, it would have thrown out the votes of more than 1.5 million of Johnson's fellow Wisconsinites, 2.8 million Michigan voters who voted for Joe Biden. I mean, that's a hell of a moment, particularly for somebody running for reelection like Ron Johnson, and he doesn't have a good explanation for it, except that he was really deep down that rabbit hole of the conspiracy theory here.
No, I guess maybe I'm wrong about this. But didn't his chief, I think it was his chief of staff,
Yeah.
text Pence's legislative affairs, assistant, to
Correct.
say, "Hey, my boss, or however he put it, Senator Johnson wants to deliver something to Vice President Pence," and the guy said, "No way," So I mean, I don't think you do that just on your own, right? I mean, you don't say that your boss, the senator, wants to bring something to the vice president, not an everyday occurrence, certainly not on January 6th, given what the thing to be brought was, these fake elector slates. You don't do that just because some guy got in touch with you and you just decided on your own to text the vice president's legislative affairs aide. So no, Johnson knew about it, and he's dissembling, and maybe it'll hurt him. So on the broader, and I think it will hurt him, I guess. So on the broader question, I think it's very interesting. And there was a little Twitter exchange, not exchange, just comment on this. And it's clear, and Simon Rosenberg, if you know him, the Democrat, has actually written quite interestingly about this, and then been challenged by others. And I don't know who's right. So here's what we know. What we know is Biden is way underwater right now. In Pennsylvania, the last poll I saw, he was 36 approve, 61 disapprove. And Fetterman was winning the Senate race, the Democrat by, I
Mhm.
don't know, 8 points or something, and
9. Yeah.
Shapiro by about
Mhm.
4, I think, the
Mhm.
governor's
Correct.
race. And they both had pretty good favorable, unfavorable. Now, you could say 4 against that guy. Mastriani is not great, but still, it's winning, and Biden's way underwater. So there's a decoupling right now in real time of the Biden approval from at least some of these Senate and governor's races, especially where the Republicans are really bad candidates or extremists, and the Democrats seem sensible and often have personal decent approval ratings. I think Shapiro is probably better than your man Evers in Wisconsin, but Whitmer, but they're not way underwater like Biden. And one point of view is, okay, that's these are real polls. This is apples and apples. I mean, this isn't the same poll. These results. This isn't like playing with numbers, right? People in
Right.
real time are saying, I don't approve of Biden, and I'm willing to vote for a Democrat for governor or senator. I think that could sustain itself. I think you could just have a different phenomenon than some of the social science types are used to, where the presidential approval kind of just doesn't transfer that much. Biden is sort of in his own world up there in the White House, and people look at the Congress and maybe they even want Republicans to win the House. That's a little different. But they look at this actual statewide candidate for senator, and especially that's if a governor, where they have real implications for their lives and for the election in 24. And they think, oof, no, that's a bridge too far. I think that could hold through the election. Or this is the counter argument. These things tend to kind of get pulled back to the president's approval. Amy Walter had a formulation for it. It's like the cyclist who gets out in front of the rest of his team. I don't know anything about cycling, but I guess in the peloton, but he's like the sprinter, but then the rest of the race, the rest of the crowd catches up to him, and that sometimes does happen in races too, that the kind of individuals, the
Right.
positives get dragged down to the party's numbers get dragged down to the president's numbers. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think there are things you could do as a party, the Democrats could do to try to keep these individual candidates up there, keep the Republicans, disqualify the Republican opponents as much as possible, and frankly, not make the race about Biden. The trouble is, the
It's
Biden
hard.
administration probably thinks we got to help. We got to keep proposing things because we got to get our boss's numbers up. But actually, it's hurting. It's hurting. I mean, do this thought experiment. If Biden hadn't said anything about gas prices this week, of course, it's hurting the Biden
Mhm.
administration, hurting Democrats some. But if he had just said, "Look, I'm focused on a NATO summit next week. I've got Ukraine. Here's what I'm doing in this area. Whatever. We're looking at helping states who want to preserve abortion rights to do so." Whatever he said, right? I mean, there are plenty of things he could have talked about. Instead, because it's a White House, and this is how White Houses are, they think Biden's way underwater on gas prices. We have to have a ludicrous, honestly, just ridiculous gas holiday proposal, which then, of course, all the Democratic candidates have to comment on. So, do we have a Biden White House that could almost willingly step aside? I mean, the ultimate example of this would be Biden saying he wouldn't run in 2024, which I would also be fine with, but that's not going to happen in the very near future. But in a way, openly, sort of purposely recede to let a reasonably popular Republican like a Democrat like Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, and a reason running against an unpopular Republican, to let that advantage stick and not get dragged down by Biden. I think it's an interesting question of almost political discipline. I don't have great faith that the Democrats can pull that will pull that off. I think the Biden White House will think it all depends on them and actually put themselves right in the middle of everything, which is not wise at this point.
Yeah, I think Amy Walter has a good analogy. She talks about the fact that it's good news that Senate Democrats are outpacing Biden's numbers in their states, and as she points out, the GOP's only begun the campaign to link them to Biden and to hammer them on other stuff. And here's her analogy: it's like a cyclist in a breakaway. Once the peloton starts to pick up their pace and chase, that lone biker gets caught.
Right.
So back to Ron John here in Wisconsin. I mean, here in Wisconsin, Biden is underwater, 40% approval, 50% disapproval. Johnson, however, is also underwater. He's got a 37% approval rating, 46% unfavorable. So even though you have this massive Republican wave building, he's running even or behind Democrats who are all, let me put it this way, not well-known Democrats. Mandela Barnes, who I think has got a lot of baggage, leads him 46-44, well within the margin of error. Sarah Godlewski, 45-43. Tom Nelson, 44-43. So this just said what you're describing, that there is this disconnect. The other question, of course, and we don't know this, and this is all speculative, but even in a massive Republican wave, it is possible the Republicans blow it just out of like weirdness. If they nominate Eric Greitens, with the fascist gun hunting rhino ad in Missouri, Herschel Walker, who is a serial abuser, liar, just whatever. Senate candidates like this, or Dr. Oz, the New Jersey millionaire who's running in Pennsylvania, you could manage to blow their chances of winning the Senate by nominating these very strange, embarrassing candidates that might fall short even in a wave election year. I mean, are
Absolutely.
they too strange to win? It's happened before, and so we just don't know what the dynamics are this year.
No,
And
that's right. And I think,
Johnson would be one of them. I mean,
yeah,
Johnson, Herschel Walker, Dr. Oz, Eric Greitens, there goes the Republican chances for the Senate right there.
yeah, I would say even with just
Yeah.
Pennsylvania and
Yeah.
Wisconsin, it probably goes.
Mhm.
Unlikely to pick up more than two Democratic seats. Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I don't know. And I think this is the point Rosenberg makes. I mean, it's not obvious it's going to be a massive wave. There'll be a tide,
Mm,
Now, and right now it's about 3 points in the generic ballot, which isn't big enough to really sweep everyone out. I mean, that will be, it's a bit of a, if you want the analogy again, it's a bit of a drag. It's a bit of an uphill ride, but it's not impossible. Now, people who've been through this before say the wave doesn't break till late. If you want to, you can
yeah.
use the metaphor of the wave. The one reason it's used a lot is you look out into the horizon and it's like just the ocean looks okay. And then as it gets close to shore, you realize, that's a big wave. And that could happen. That happened in '06. I remember George Allen here in Virginia, who was ahead and was thinking of running for president in a way. He was pretty popular, made a couple of mistakes. And then the whole wave came in '06 against George W. Bush and the Republicans, and Allen lost here in Virginia. So at the time, kind of a Republicanish state. So it could happen. I'm a little less confident than most people that it will, though. I do think people are just too quick to, history shows this. And it's also recently people have lived through '06 and then 2010 and then 2014. They just, in 2018, they have just a presumption that it's always a wave, but it's not always that much of a wave. It wasn't in '98 and '02. And if you get, a bit of January 6th hearing, a bit of Trump activity, a little
Well,
bit of
Roe
Roe v.
versus Wade.
Wade,
Yeah.
and then the particular extremist candidates, all of it together could add up to, I very much think Republicans, Democrats right now, I'd sort of bet a little bit over 50-50 that they have a little better than 50-50 chance to hold the Senate. The House is more susceptible to just the usual off-year currents, and I think that's going to be hard to hold.
Well, except that there aren't that many competitive seats anymore. I mean,
But there
that's
are fewer seats. So I think if they lose the House, they'll lose 20 seats. And right now is what I would say, and therefore have the Republicans would have a 12 something seat majority, and that something in that ballpark. I don't think we're looking at a Republican 40 seat majority. So I'm a bit of a skeptic, but I also am open to the proposition that, and the final point I just make on this, even in the Biden question, though I think there's a lot of decoupling, sort of matters if you could argue the bad news is in, things aren't going to get even worse on the
yeah.
economy, on gas prices and so forth. They're already kind of discounted by the political market, if you want to call it that. And therefore, we're sort of seeing the bottom of Biden. But I've got to say on that, I'm a little worried because we could have like inflation and a recession by October or something. And we could have various things not going great. And I do think the decoupling is interesting. I mean, Biden is so low profile, I don't know if that's the right word, just makes so little news, honestly, and is so far from people's minds that if you're living in Pennsylvania, do you think I can't vote for Josh Shapiro for governor or for Fetterman for Senate because of Biden? Or do you just think, I don't know, Biden, what's he seems too old, and anyway, I'm not really crazy about him running again. But meanwhile, I've got to cast these ballots for this actual senator and actual governor. I could see the decoupling we're seeing now in the polls sustaining itself.
And that's why Amy Walter's saying we have to, see if you're the Republicans and you need to spend tens of millions of dollars coupling, locking them together.
Fetterman's an automatic vote for the Biden agenda, right? And that might work in
Okay.
some cases. Certainly might work against some incumbents who voted over and over for the Biden agenda. I think in a weird way, being a Democratic challenger in that respect, being Fetterman, being Godlewski, I think that's her name in
Yeah,
Wisconsin, I think would be a stronger candidate than
I agree.
Mandela Barnes. Being the Democrat running
Totally.
against Greitens can actually be stronger than being a Democratic incumbent.
So, okay, so this is like a slight digression here because I know the Democrats are never going to take my advice on any of this stuff, but I'm sorry. Have you seen a picture of Dr. Oz's house in New Jersey?
No, I don't think so.
It
It's
is
not. I'm going to guess that it's on the
it's like
palatial side.
yeah, yes, exactly. You can't describe it in mansion terms. It is palatial. It is just off the charts, but it's also in New Jersey.
Right.
So I mean, if these guys are any good at it, you can imagine sorry, you can imagine Fetterman
Yeah.
standing there in his shorts and in his hoodie, with a picture of this saying, "This is Dr. Oz's house in New Jersey. I do not live in a house like this. I actually, I live in this house over here, which happens to be in Pennsylvania, unlike Dr. Oz's house here." And do you think that this guy actually understands the problems of working class Pennsylvanians? And play that card, because at
Right.
some point there is this huge dissonance. Like I'm sorry, I'm not playing a. I'm not comfortable with class warfare stuff, but at a certain point, it's like, how can you possibly understand how average people live their lives? And plus, you're from fucking out of town. You're from out of
Yeah.
state.
I think the out
Make
of
an
town.
issue of that.
Yeah, and I think the out of town, out of state stuff seems to work. There was this one primary last Tuesday, I guess it was just Tuesday, a runoff in Georgia, and it was a very attractive young candidate, African Americans that happened Republican. I mean, who was endorsed by Cotton and Cruz and all kinds of people, kind of future of the party. But he actually had sort of moved, I gather, from Atlanta to this district, which is a little bit a ways, to kind of run. Or had moved there and maybe not to run, but in any case, he hadn't lived in the district long. And running against this kind of more ordinary, you might say, pedestrian Republican candidate, they were both pro-Trump, so I don't think that was really an issue. And his only attack on this other candidate, since they didn't disagree on anything, and the other guy is younger and I think served in the military and sort of seems attractive and impressive, was he's not really from this district. And the other candidate won. I think it's just 6th district of Georgia. And so it does tell me that there is a lot, districts and states still have some attachment to the notion that you should live in this state unless you're maybe Hillary Clinton moving to New York. That's like the exception. But New York's also different that way, right? I think it does
Robert
feel different.
Kennedy.
It probably feels different in Scranton or in Western Pennsylvania. If some rich guy from Jersey is just showing up
Well,
and trying to be your senator.
speaking of messy Wisconsin politics, I have a little item in my newsletter today. Donald Trump has, for reasons that are somewhat incomprehensible to me, has weighed into the Republican primary for governor here in Wisconsin. I mean, Republicans, really have no excuse not to win the governorship here this year, except they're going to have this very, very nasty primary. So he has endorsed this out-of-state millionaire named Tim Michels against Scott Walker's former lieutenant governor. So there's a proxy war between Scott Walker and Donald Trump here in Wisconsin. Walker pushing the former Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Clayfish, Trump pushing this businessman named Tim Michels, who owns a $17 million mansion in, wait for it, Connecticut.
Wow.
Now, you don't think that that's going to be an issue in the primary here? So while Republicans, would normally, you'd think that would be sort of lining up and, coming up with their message and pushing against the incumbent, this is going to be a food fight here. And actually, it's going to be much worse than that.
What do you think happens? Do you have a view on who's going to win? Or
I would assume that Clayfish will have the edge because she just has more grassroots support. There was a Marquette University poll out yesterday that showed that Michels is ahead like 27, 26, but the margin of error in the poll is like 6 points. So, but he's been gone for years, and I'm just not sure that a Trump endorsement, is going to carry that much weight when voters vote in August. But it is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, so we've been talking about politics. We've been talking about domestic politics. We need to talk about, in just a heads up, the Thursday night Bulwark live stream will feature retired General Mark Hertling tonight, talking about the war in Ukraine 100 plus days on. And I think that is going to be extraordinary. The Thursday night Bulwark live stream, which is available to Bulwark Plus members. People can watch it on replay as well on the site. I think it's going to be very, very interesting because Mark Hertling has been, I think, one of the most sober, well-informed, and intelligent observers of what's happening and what's not happening in Ukraine.
No, I think Mark's been terrific, and I'm really looking forward to learning that from him. He had a very good Twitter thread a couple of days ago, being slightly more optimistic, actually, about the Ukrainians, pushing back a little against the notion that the Russians are just kind of wearing them down and can do so endlessly. I have a conversation coming. I do those conversations with Bill Kristol, with Eric Edelman, who had senior positions in state and defense and the White House, actually, and very sober and experienced national security expert. That'll be out actually today at the same time as this podcast,
Mm.
and people can watch that for an hour or listen to it. And Eric also, thinks people may be being a little too pessimistic with the military situation, but he's worried. I guess I'm worried too about where we are 3-4 months ago. If the Biden administration doesn't accelerate the delivery of weapons to Russia, stop self-deterring so much, maybe break the blockade, which is doing real damage to the Ukrainian economy and actually to other economies around the world, since all this grain is piling up in Ukraine and there's food shortages coming in places like Lebanon and Egypt. If the Biden administration isn't willing to, it doesn't. If there's such a reluctance to have American advisors, set foot on Ukrainian soil to help them use some of these weapons, which means it takes longer to train them outside the country. There's such a reluctance to maybe have a humanitarian convoy to escort Ukrainian ships out of Odessa or Ukraine to deliver food, which is incidentally they have every right to do. There's no, the blockade that Russia has is informal, but they haven't announced one, which would be an act of war, because they want to kind of maintain this special military operation stuff. And here on the energy policy, they've been so bad, the Biden administration. They've done very little to help relieve European dependence on Russian oil and gas, since, God forbid, we should actually develop all this oil and gas we have. So that will start to hit in October, November as cold weather begins in Europe, and the Russians will start to tighten the screws. So I'd say, Eric, and I think this is true of Mark Hertling too, or I think reasonably okay in the short term, but worried about the medium term, worried that the Biden administration, which has done a pretty good job in some ways, hasn't done comprehensively enough a good job.
Why? Why have they been
I don't know. It's a
slow?
good question. It's been slow, but also timid, a little cautious, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. And we've had a back and forth, even within the Bulwark family, about whether or not they have done enough, whether this is a success. And, much of what they have done has been successful. But time and time again, there is that self-deterring, and I won't say timidity, but just reluctance to actually do what is necessary. And now you're mentioning the ports. Obviously, that would be the most aggressive move, because there's the possibility that you might have conflict between NATO vessels or American vessels and Russian vessels. But if there was, it would be a clear case of Russian aggression, right? I mean, we have had the Berlin airlift, right? I mean, Joe Biden, with this mentality, we would never have done the Berlin airlift.
No, and it's kind of important to establish the principle you don't get, if you're an aggressive dictator, to sort of shut down the other country's commerce as well. And you don't get to shut down third-party nations, whether it's us or a coalition of the willing, so to speak, or NATO, engaging in humanitarian efforts to help both the economy of Ukraine, which has been attacked, but also of other countries, by making sure the grain doesn't rot in silos. So, no, I think they're too timid on this, and maybe they'll change a little bit. I think but it is worrisome. Eric also points out an experienced diplomat who's prepared many presidents for summit meetings and so forth, and knows kind of what that's like. That there's a NATO summit next week, not the single biggest news probably compared to Roe v. Wade and all this. Sweden and Finland have applied for membership. It would be excellent to have them in. It really will be a big moment of strengthening NATO's deterrence. This is where Putin's thing has backfired. But Turkey's objecting. It's basically just bribe. I mean, Erdogan wants attention, and he wants some actual, probably some practical, aid. And it's funny, the Biden White House is sort of, well, we don't want to get in the middle of this. The president shouldn't get, should be handled maybe by other NATO countries. And again, a slight reluctance. He's the president of the United States. Very much in our interest, hugely in our interest to have Sweden and Finland in and send the signal of what that suggests to the Baltic nations and to Putin, incidentally. And, Biden's got to make that happen next week. And then the trip 2 weeks later to the Middle East, where he goes to Saudi Arabia. And I'm very worried about that. I just think, I'm not happy about the trip, period. Eric's a little more understanding of it. But B, looking like a supplicant to MBS, they should drill more oil. Yeah. Instead of just saying, look, for now, we're going to have to give many more permits here and speed up the permitting process and let people drill on public lands, because we need to get gas prices down globally. We need to help our European allies. We need to help American consumers. It just looks weak, don't you think? And I feel like
I think it looks very weak.
Yeah, so
No, and it looks weak and looks feckless. And, and unfortunately, look, the reality is there's not much that the president can do to bring down oil prices in the near term. You're right. It is an absurd gimmick, the gas tax holiday, and I was listening to some of the Democrats in Congress who were talking about, trying to make this about, the oil company gouging. I'm not an economist, but, we are talking about a global marketplace. And there is a kind of a feeling of flailing around about it as opposed to something else. But unfortunately, your point about Saudi Arabia, not only is it morally problematic, but I think it will highlight the gas price problem and his inability to do anything about it. So it's morally problematic, and it will signal this kind of weakness, which is unfortunate. So
Yeah, and I think Putin sees that incidentally and thinks, gee, MBS was awfully unpopular 3 or 4 years ago when he had Khashoggi murdered. But you know what? If I just hang in there, they'll come back to me too, because, economics and oil and gas trump everything. And so it's a little bit of a stretch.
And
Putin's not MBS or vice versa, but still, I worry about that signal as well.
And if Trump comes back, that's like
Totally.
we'll all be having a podcast where we'll say, can you ever imagine that Vladimir Putin would be back in the White House, that he would
Right.
actually the American president? So while you and I are speaking, Supreme Court is handing down decisions. The term is almost at an end. Everybody's waiting for Dobbs, which is the big Roe versus Wade decision. It did not come down today, but we did get a relatively big gun case. The Supreme Court, on a vote of 6-3, struck down the New York gun control law that required people to show proper cause to get a license to carry a concealed handgun outside the home. This is not surprising at all. But obviously, it's interesting that given everything that's happening right now, that they are weakening gun laws. But I have to admit, I am surprised by this bipartisan gun safety legislation that's going through the Senate. I just assumed that it would blow up like it has every other time in the past. Are you surprised? Did you think it would happen? I mean, it's a good thing. It shows grown-ups can get in the room and legislate. And it is a big setback for the NRA. But were you surprised that they were able to put together 64 votes in the Senate for this piece of legislation?
I mean, one has to be surprised these days when they can put together
Anything.
64 votes for anything. And maybe it's heralds maybe a little bit something similar on the Electoral Count Act, which again isn't going to solve anything, just like everything, just like this gun control legislation doesn't solve everything. But it would be good for the country, honestly, and good for the particular issues to have some strengthening, obviously, of our electoral guardrails. You'd think after these January 6th hearings, that would be pretty much a no-brainer. So I think it's a little heartening. And some Democrats I notice are complaining, how could you give the Republicans this victory? It takes them off the hook. I don't agree with that, though, entirely. It split the Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene is campaigning against it. Ted Cruz is denouncing the other senators for going along with it. And I think anything that splits your opponents is good, even if it gives some of them a little bit of a talking point. There aren't many who are up for re-election who went with it. It's interesting, the Republicans still think Marco Rubio, he was up for re-election in Florida. He doesn't have a primary. I would have thought he would be okay with this kind of, very modest gun control legislation the way John Cornyn is. And Rubio's against it. I really wonder if that's a popular position in Florida, where the Parkland shooting took place, incidentally.
I think that's interesting. Bill Kristol, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm looking forward to listening and watching your conversation with Eric Edelman. And of course, we'll all be watching today's January 6th committee hearing and wait on what the Supreme Court's going to do over the next week. Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Charlie.
The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow to do this all over again.
There are about 1 million podcasts about money, but Bad with Money with Gabby Dunn is the one where finances meet social justice.
Investing in dating with Bella Gandhi.
Do you believe that people should pay for dating apps?
To me, invest in the dating process. There's nothing more important than finding the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. There's a stigma. Everything should be free. You're going to go to Whole Foods, meet eyes over mangoes, and all the dominoes fall in perfect order. That's just a load of garbage.
Bad with Money. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.